go ahead and start now. Good morning, afternoon, evening. Thank you all for joining today's webinar to learn more about women's diets, roles in agriculture and nutrition, findings from Nepal, Uganda, and Tanzania. My name is Robin Shrestha, and I'm the Regional Project Manager for the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Nutrition. And I will be your MC today. As more attendees are joining the webinar, I will begin by going over some of the housekeeping. I would like to direct all attendees to a new function on this Zoom webinar. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat icon and a Q&A icon. Please use the chat feature to engage in relevant conversation with the other attendees. If you have a question for one of the panelists, please use the Q&A feature. Panelists will respond to questions in the Q&A as they are able to. We have allotted the final 20 minutes of this webinar for Q&A, at which point the panelists will respond to any remaining questions from the audience. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, send a message in the chat to panelists so that our technical support staff can work with you to help resolve any technical issues. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Innovation Lab for Nutrition and the USAID Advancing Nutrition websites. You can also register for upcoming webinars and view previous recordings and slide decks on our websites. We will repeat these technical housekeeping items in the chat throughout the webinar as people may be joining in at later times. So I will begin the webinar today by introducing our moderator, Dr. Eileen Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is a former dean of the Friedman School. Currently a professor at the school, Dr. Kennedy's research interests include assessing the health, nutrition, diet, and food security impacts of policies and programs, nutrient density and diet diversity, and agriculture nutrition linkages. She has been a member of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the UN Committee on World Food Security, and a member of the UNSCN Advisory Group on Nutrition. She founded and was the first executive director of the USDA Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. She created the Healthy Eating Index, which is used as a single summary measure of diet quality. Dr. Kennedy will give a brief background on the Innovation Lab for Nutrition, our research, and the webinar series. She will then begin the webinar by introducing our panelists. Dr. Kennedy, pleasure to have you here, and over to you.
Thank you, Robin. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this latest webinar, Women's Diet's Role in Agriculture and Nutrition, findings from 3 countries, Nepal, Uganda, and Tanzania. And this series of this particular webinar is being sponsored by the USAID Feed the Future Nutrition Innovation Lab. If we go back to the first slide, please. And you'll see here that the Nutrition Innovation Lab is working in a wide variety of countries around the world. The next slide, with a very broad range of both global and local partners. In addition, if we look at the next slide, there are a number of US government partners who have been involved in the Nutrition Innovation Lab. And finally, in the next slide, we see that there's an enormous amount of collaborators and support in all of the countries in which the NIL colleagues work. Now, again, it is my pleasure to introduce the 3 panelists, the 3 presenters. And I have to say, it is always difficult for me to introduce somebody who I know very well. And in this case, Dr. Keith West. Keith and I don't even want to say how many years, but Keith and I have known each other many, many, many years. We've worked on projects, initiatives together, and this includes the Nutrition Innovation Lab. So let me keep the introduction brief. Keith is a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He has published widely in nutrition. And I always like to remind people that Keith's friends, colleagues, and students affectionately refer to him as Dr. Vitamin A. Our next presenter is Alexandra Bellows, who's a PhD student, again at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Alexandra's research concentrates on the linkages between agriculture, food environment, and diet quality. And the third presenter is Nasul Kabunga, recently with the International Food Policy Research Institute. Currently, he is an evaluation research economist with the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, in addition to being a consultant on the Uganda National Information Platform for Nutrition. And with that, I will hand it over to Keith as our first presenter.
Thank you, Eileen, and hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share with you some of the exciting data that has been collected through the Feed the Future Nutrition Innovation Lab activities in Nepal with the Poshan community studies that our Hopkins team has been leading and implementing with partners in Nepal with our colleagues at Tufts University over the past decade almost. The title of this talk is really also the end message. So if you have to tune out, just look at the first slide and you'll have gotten the primary message of this presentation, that if it's grown in the household, mothers eat more. Without necessarily implying a direct causal relationship, the associations you'll find are quite convincing. As a background, women are at, next slide please, women are at high risk in South Asia of an inadequate diet. They are at high risk of micronutrient deficiencies because of an inadequate diet, poor dietary diversity, and in terms of amounts of nutritious food, a chronic problem that we will see when we put data behind that issue. Nepal is also in the midst of a nutrition transition as modest increases in expendable income become available, and the flood of snack foods in markets across low middle income countries that we're all aware of. Home food production, though, offers a direct pathway for improving the diets of women. And we know that, but it's very nice to have data that can reveal and test and reveal the strength and the direction, the robustness, and the potential responsiveness to programs along this pathway. And so that's the focus of this presentation. Next slide. Just as a regional and global view, recent paper from Borasa et al. Showing micronutrient deficiencies in different regions of the world, and the box indicates the regional pattern of micronutrient deficiencies in Southeast Asian countries, which reflect a poor diet. In our own work in southern Nepal, next slide, we see many micronutrient deficiencies in women who are pregnant. And the message here is the more you look, the more you find, and what you find is not the same. And so it reflects the composition of diet, it reflects the foods that are being consumed at the time of assessment, but also throughout the year, because these are chronic issues. Next slide. This is findings from a study that we carried out in the Terai of Nepal several years ago. Throughout the entire year, doing 7-day food frequencies of pregnant women year-round in several thousand women, and showing the monotony of the diet throughout the year. Also that rice in the staple crop is eaten twice a day, and the pulses might be eaten once to twice a day. Potato is popular, and then along the bottom there are a bunch of lines that reflect animal source foods, vegetables, and their frequency is low throughout the year. And the continuity of that throughout the year gives you confidence about one time in the year if you happen to be assessing the diets of such a population. Next slide. Also, keep in mind there's seasonality. In the agricultural calendar, these are different foods shown in the pre-monsoon, monsoon, post-monsoon season. And we need to be aware that when we ask about dietary intakes, that we need to be aware of the season that we're in. I've noted tomatoes and cauliflower there because the study that I'm going to present has been done in the monsoon season. And so it reflects, what we see reflects some of that seasonality. Next slide. Our conceptual diagram is one that that's driving our studies, is one from going from agriculture to nutrition pathways, that if there are crops and gardens and markets, that can lead to better household food security. When there's some wealth, there's purchases that happen. That can affect dietary intake and other aspects of life that can affect nutrition and health of women and children. And when you collect information along those lines, you can inform policies and programs that can affect each of those levels of input. And that is where our Poshan community studies comes into play. This is a study that was to aim to assess in mid-year, the monsoon season, mid-June to mid-September, in 2013 through 16, in a nationally representative sample of sub-districts in Nepal, BDCs, agricultural practices with respect to what foods are grown, animal foods and crops in the rainy and harvest and the dry season rather, market availability, household food security indicators, foods purchased in the past month, dietary intake in the past week with a 7-day food frequency, and we also measure nutritional status, all in the effort to construct pathways that can be examined and quantified that can lead from agriculture to nutrition. Next slide. Next slide, please. In this sample, this is just a map of Nepal and the sampled sites that we did our studies in over the years. There are 7 systematically sampled sites across the mountains, 7 across the hills, and 7 across the Terai, with about 5,000 households examined and studied in each year, each mid-year, each monsoon season. And that gives us a rather stable number to look at from year to year. These can be found in Clemetall. The aims were to summarize then a mid-year 7-day food frequency pattern of mothers across these regions and nationally, and to estimate the direction and the strength and the stability of association from year to year of how maternal intakes relate to the growing of staple crops, animal foods, vegetables, and fruits, and also expenditures on these foods in local markets that were also assessed each year. And to look at the relative merit of household food production in improving intakes. Next slide. Our analytic approach is to take the 7-day food frequency and summarize it across 4 years, but there was 1 year where we could not do the national survey in 2015 because of a large earthquake that struck the hills and the mountains of Nepal. And so in that year, we were only able to do the Terai. So I'm only going to speak about 2013, 14, and 16 at this time. We took the approach of calculating odds ratios to reflect relative frequency of intakes of foods of families, of women in families who are producing their food versus not producing their food at home, and looking at animal source foods and crops, and also purchases, adjusted for agricultural zone, age, wealth index, and a clustering factor. We also adjusted, when we look at growing, whether we adjusted for purchasing the food, and when we look at purchasing, we adjust for growing of the food as well. Next slide. This is just a slide of the numbers of households and women interviewed each of these 3 years, about 5,000. Next slide. And this is a compilation. This is 2 slides that summarize several years of work that show the frequencies of consumption per week of women in these years that we carried out the study. Rice being consumed twice a day, dal from lentils once a day, vegetable oil gradually increasing from 2 to 3 times a day, and then meat and poultry, dairy products, egg, animal source foods 1 to 2 times a week. 1 to 2 times a week. And as well, dark green leafy vegetables about twice a week. Other fruits and vegetables, 1 to 2 times a week. And then non-carotenoid, if we want to call them, vegetables, almost 1 time a day. And other fruits twice a week. So this is, the zeros are intentional there because those zeros are the median intakes of those other foods per week in women across Nepal for year after year. Notice at the very bottom there are snacks that are eaten twice a week, and they compete in terms of frequency and food and in terms of purchases in markets with other nutritious foods. Next slide, please. When we have looked at this in a different way, we also did 24-hour recalls. I won't go into that right now, but using that data to look at how women meet the minimum dietary diversity index, only about 35 to 40% across the country meet the minimum of consuming 5 or more nutritious food groups in the FAO list in the previous 24 hours. So we are looking at a low dietary diversity population nationally. Next slide. So with that as a background, I'm going to use, we're going to look at a couple of foods as illustrative of not only the patterns, but also the role of growing food at home on the odds of women consuming more than those national medians. So the national median from year to year provides a normative metric, not necessarily an ideal one, but a normative metric to compare in a relative way the frequency of intakes of women in households that grow or raise those foods versus those households that where those foods are not raised. Next slide. So, so this is an example. This is egg intake relative to the national median in women of reproductive age. These are mothers of children, I should have said, that were assessed. So these are all women in reproductive age. And we're showing here 2013. And the odds ratio of women consuming more than the median, which is 0 for eggs, if they have grown chickens that produce eggs over the course of the year. And that's the 1.85. So they're almost 2 times as likely to consume eggs if they have grown them. And then the orange dot is controlling for, adjusting for in the model for whether they purchased eggs in the previous month. And so we see an approximately 2 to 3-fold higher odds of consuming eggs in 2013 if women are in households that have grown that food. The right side is purchase. So if they purchase foods, this is the odds of eating more than the national median. And so people buy food to eat it. They don't always grow food to eat it because it can be sold and so forth. So you would expect normally the odds ratios to be higher for purchasing the food than for growing the food. But we're focusing on growing. That's 2013. If we go forward to 2016, on the right side, we see basically the same pattern. And I'm not showing 2014, but it mimics what we are seeing here in these two years. That if women grow chickens and produce eggs, they are more likely to eat them. And obviously also to purchase them. Next slide. If we look at chicken and then consumption of chicken, the y-axis, the odds ratio is going to change here because there are confidence intervals that are different sizes. So the y-axis is not a constant one, and to keep that in mind. But if a household has chickens in the household, if they are growing chickens, there's a 1.5 to 2 times increased odds of women consuming. They may not be consuming the chickens that are being produced at a particular time, but they are in the habit of eating chicken. They grow chicken, they eat chicken, they're more likely to have it in their diet. Obviously, that is also true if they are going out to purchase chicken in the previous month. Notice that the median is 0. So this means growing means eating any chicken versus on average, no chicken during the week. And if we look at 2016, we see the exactly same pattern. Different year, independent procedures, same sample sites, but a different year altogether, and we see the very same pattern, and it's true for 2014 as well. Next slide, please. If we look at meats, and meat food being goat, buffalo, hogs for pork, and we look at 2013, there, you don't see the confidence intervals there, but they're above 1. So there's a 30 to 60% increased chance of women consuming meats if those animals are grown in the household above the median of 1 time per week. And if they purchase it, it's 7 to 8 times more likely that they are consuming above the national median. If we look at 2016, we see the same pattern. More likely to consume if grow, and of course, purchasing. And controlling for purchasing doesn't change these odds ratios very much. Next slide. Except for dairy. We see that if milk is produced, if they have animals that are producing milk, women are going to be consuming more of it above the median of 2 times per week, but not if they purchase. And we think that's because they are purchasing probably for their young children rather than for themselves. And we see that same pattern in 2016, if we go to the right, the pattern hasn't changed. So there's stability and continuity in these relationships. Next slide. If we look at some staples like rice, we see that these whether they're grown or purchased, they hover around 1 for 2013, and 2016, they hover around 1 as well. If we look at that, please. There we go. And so if I can borrow the economist term, rice consumption is inelastic to the source of rice. Women are going to eat rice whether they grow it or don't grow it. If they don't grow it, they'll purchase it. And so we see that continuity and in the relationship with respect to staples. Next slide. We see it with respect to the lentil, the dal that goes with rice. A little bit more a tendency to consume more if it's purchased, but if it's grown, it's right around 1. Next year, please. And that's true for 2016 as well. If we move on to another food, dark green leafy vegetables, we see that if the foods are grown in the household, they're going to be eaten more likely to be consumed by women. And that's true for growing and adjusting for purchasing. It becomes more important when you adjust that for purchasing. And if they buy, it's the same relationship. For 2016, we see expectedly same pattern, but the location of those odds ratios are a little bit different for purchasing. And that may relate to market conditions in the year 2016 during the time when we were doing the study. Next slide. Here's cauliflower. If it's grown during the year, there's no increase in intake. And going back to that seasonality graph, we were in a season when cauliflower was not grown. So if they do grow during the year, it's a different time of the year and it's not affecting necessarily their intake right now. They want to eat cauliflower, they have to go to the markets, which are at times perfused with some of these foods, and buy it. And if they buy it, they'll consume it. Next slide. And finally, example of fruit. This is papaya. Notice that the y-axis is compressed here, but it's 3 to 4 times, 5 times more likely to consume papaya if that tree is sitting in the backyard, if they're growing papaya in 2013, and even more so in 2016. But the pattern is stable. Next slide. So maternal diets in Nepal, on average, are meager from year to year. There's some, if you study those 75th percentiles interquartile range, there's some evidence of movement forward with time. Those who are better off are going to eat more as income goes up. But basically, it's 2 rice meals and with one with dal and one with the vegetables, with some green leafy vegetables from time to time. one animal source food every other day, fruit every other day, and oil intake is going up. 40% are chronically not, or only 40% are meeting their minimum dietary diversity. So it's a meager diet across Nepal year to year. Next slide. But home food production is associated with a better diet. So the relative odds of mothers eating foods more often than the national median is increased if they are from households that produce these foods year after year. If they are growing chickens, goats, buffalo, hogs, growing vegetables, fruit, it's roughly 1.5 to 4 times more likely that women are consuming those foods in the previous week than the national median for that year. There's my timer. And when you adjust these odds ratios for purchasing, they shift depending on the market, depending on the food, depending on the year, but it remains a constant relationship. And staples are eaten, whether it's grown or purchased. Next slide. This assessment approach allowed us to look at a constant season pattern of intake from year to year. So we're controlling for season. Midpoint monsoon is not the best season, not the worst season. It's an average of the year, so to speak. And it allows from year to year these patterns to be assessed for their stability and change. It does not address seasonality. One has to do these assessments during different seasons in order to look at the seasonality of intakes, which we have done in Poshan, not being presented today. By assessing the same sites in a random sample, nationally representative, we're able to limit the extraneous variability due to geographic location, and also using the same protocol, we limit the variation due to methodological differences. The odds ratio approach with a national median threshold, which should not be taken as a desirable equilibrium, it's just the normative for that year. It does provide an interpretable metric to evaluate the relative merits of growing foods at the home in terms of how it relates to women's diets. But you could use other thresholds as well. Next slide. So, hit that again, Grace. In this talk, we've talked about crops and gardens and markets in this model. Some indication of wealth with respect to ability to purchase foods and how that relates to their frequency of intake, and how that relates then to diet. We've kept it in that band of this model for today's presentation. It's data that encourages programs and policies that can continue to increase local food production in the home across the country. Next slide. I'd like to acknowledge many of agencies, institutions, our colleagues at USAID in Washington and in Nepal, and our colleagues at Tufts University, government of Nepal, and our agencies that we worked with, New Era and NTAG in Kathmandu, did the field work. Lots of contributors to this effort. Next slide. Including individuals. I'd like to call out Binod Shrestha, who did the analyses for this presentation and is writing a paper on these data. Our advisors, the team at Hopkins and New Era and NTAG. Next slide. I think the next slide is the next talker, the next speaker. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be with you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Alexandra Bellows, and I would like to thank you for the opportunity to share some of my research on the relationship between dietary diversity and agricultural diversity in a rural district in Tanzania. I'm currently a doctoral student at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, but today I'll be presenting work that I did as a student and researcher at Harvard under the mentorship of Dr. Wafai Fauzi, who kindly gave me the opportunity to present research from our team today. This research was done in collaboration with colleagues at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Ifakara Health Institute, Sokoine University of Agriculture, with support from the Izumi Foundation and Nutrition Innovation Lab. Next slide, please. The Tanzanian government has prioritized growth in agriculture to reduce poverty and improve food security, and agriculture consists of 30% of Tanzanian GDP. In addition, agriculture industry is one of the largest employers in Tanzania, with 65% of adults being employed in agriculture. Most of the agriculture in Tanzania is dominated by smallholder farmers, with evidence of home consumption, since on average about 35% of crops are sold at the market from these smallholder farmers. Most common crops grown by smallholder farmers are maize, cassava, paddy, sorghum, and bananas. Next slide. So with this evidence of home consumption, myself and colleagues from Harvard, Ifakara Health, Sokoine University, and Tufts decided to explore the relationship between agriculture diversity and dietary diversity for women of reproductive age in Rufiji, Tanzania. The results I'm sharing with you today are from an analysis that was recently published in the Food and Nutrition Bulletin Journal earlier this year. This was a cross-sectional analysis from a baseline survey of a cluster randomized controlled trial, which we refer to as HANU for Homestead Agriculture and Nutrition Initiative. The aim of the trial was to assess the efficacy of a homestead gardening intervention on dietary diversity. This analysis looked at the relationship between agriculture diversity and dietary diversity prior to the start of the homestead gardening intervention. We enrolled approximately 1,000 women from 10 villages in the Rufiji district, which is located about 180 kilometers south of Dar es Salaam along the coast. Villages were purposely selected from an ongoing DSS surveillance, which is highlighted in the dark red region on the map. Eligibility criteria included households with a woman of reproductive age, at least one child less than 36 months of age, and access to land for agricultural use. Next slide. Baseline data collection took place from August to October in 2016, which is considered to be in the harvest season for this area. After consenting to participate in the study, participants answered questions regarding household demographics, women's health, agricultural production, physical activity, women's empowerment, food security, and dietary intake. We calculated dietary diversity scores from a 30-day food frequency questionnaire, and foods were categorized into 10 food groups using FAO guidance for minimum dietary diversity for women. Since we were using a food frequency questionnaire, not 24-hour recall, we used this questionnaire to estimate on average daily consumption. For agricultural diversity scores, we calculated scores using two different methods that have been used in the previous literature. The data came from asking participants to list crops grown by household within the last year across all growing seasons. First, we used crop nutritional functional richness score, which categorizes crops into 7 food groups consistent with the agricultural food groups in the dietary diversity scores. And secondly, crop species richness scores, which counts the number of crop species grown by a household. On average, households had approximately 7 individuals per household. 33% of women reported no formal education, while 58% of women reported some primary education. This was an area of high food insecurity, as 51% of households reported experiencing some form of food insecurity in the last month. The majority of households participating in agriculture, and average land size was slightly less than 1 hectare, which is a bit smaller than the national average for smallholder farms in Tanzania. 1/3 of households reported ownership of livestock, with the majority of livestock owning households owning chickens. On average, households grew 3 crops throughout the year from an average of 1.5 food groups. The 5 most common crops grown were maize, rice, sesame, cassava, and cashews, which is also consistent with the most common crops grown at the national level as well. In addition, it is not surprising that most of the crops grown could be considered a cash crop, as these villages are located on a major highway a few hours south of Dar es Salaam. The majority of households in all villages reported growing starchy staples, with the second highest food group grown being nuts and seeds. And as you can see from the graph below, there's a lot of heterogeneity in agriculture diversity between villages, with the two villages in the middle reporting growing the most food groups. And this will be important to note for the next slide when I talk about dietary diversity. Next. On average, women consumed about 3 food groups per day, with the 5 most common foods consumed being ugali, fried fish, okra, fresh fish, and rice. The high consumption of fish may be unique to this region of Tanzania, which is located near the Rufiji River Delta, where fish is easily accessible in the market for a relatively low price. You can see that few households across all villages reported consuming nuts and seeds, even though that was the second most reported crop food grown. There's also a lot of heterogeneity between communities, and what is potentially most surprising is the low dietary diversity in the 2 villages with the highest agricultural diversity. And then information from our study team and project coordinator indicate that these 2 villages may have been experiencing a drought at the time of baseline data collection. Therefore, there is a potential for significant crop loss or households selling crops for monetary purposes instead of consumption. Next slide. We conducted a risk factor analysis looking at agricultural factors associated with dietary diversity among women of reproductive age. Multivariate analysis, which also controlled for socioeconomic status, education, and village, found that agriculture diversity score that categorized crops based on food groups, ownership of livestock, participation in cash crop production, growing of pulses, and growing of vegetables such as okra and tomatoes was associated with increased dietary diversity. Interestingly, in a separate analysis, we assessed if ownership of livestock and growing of pulses and other vegetables was associated with the consumption of the equivalent food group. We found no association existed between the ownership of livestock and meat consumption, and the growing of pulses was not associated with the consumption of pulses. Certain pulses, such as peas, have high market value in these communities. We therefore hypothesize that these factors are influencing diet through the income pathway instead of the home consumption pathway. On the other hand, growing vegetables in the other vegetable category, which includes okra and tomatoes, was associated with increased consumption of those vegetables, therefore suggesting that promotion of certain crops could increase dietary diversity through the home consumption pathway. Next slide. Overall, we did find agriculture production diversity was associated with dietary diversity among women in this study. It should be noted that agriculture diversity measured as number of food groups was not the number of crops grown was associated with higher dietary diversity. In addition, higher dietary diversity was associated with ownership of livestock, participation in cash crop agriculture, and growing of pulses, all of which suggest the income pathway may be very important to improve dietary diversity. It also should be noted that potential gains in dietary diversity from increased agriculture diversity were small, and this is consistent with the literature and other studies that have explored the relationship between dietary diversity and agriculture diversity in East Africa. This may suggest that the promotion of agriculture diversity should be in coordination with other interventions that promote dietary diversity and not a standalone policy. The results of this study highlight the relationship between market access and dietary diversity, which should be further explored in this context. Next slide. Looking forward, after analysis of baseline results, we decided to add a market assessment in our midline data collection. My colleague, Dr. Mazurera, is leading this analysis, and the paper is currently under review, which is very exciting. In addition, the 3-year trial collected end-line data in August of 2019. Results from midline are also under review, and end-line results are currently being analyzed by our team. Next slide. Finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues at the Ipakara Health Institute, Sokoine University, and Harvard Chan School of Public Health for their help and mentorship on this analysis. In addition, I would like to thank the women who agreed to participate in this trial. And finally, the Nutrition Innovation Lab and Azumi Foundation for agreeing to fund this project. I would now like to introduce Dr. Kabunga, the final speaker of this series. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alexandra. My name is Nasul Kabunga. I am going to be talking about women's empowerment, cash crops, and child growth in Uganda. This is work that is being built from the analysis that we have been doing on a lot of data, really, panel data that were collected from Uganda since 2012, and we have 3 sets. So my name is Nasul Kabunga once again, and I have been working with the Innovation Lab since 2012. So please, next slide. So we know from the setup of rural systems that cash income is very important for livelihoods because cash can increase the household's capacity to purchase improved diets, which essentially improves dietary quality and diversity. But also cash facilitates households to be able to buy other essential non-food items, for instance, health, transport, and housing. And for many rural agro-based households, selling part of their own farm produce serves as an important source of cash. So cash crops in specific terms, but also agricultural commercialization has been promoted as a way to generate cash for broader implications and has broader implications for welfare and nutrition. Next slide, please. Apparently, the evidence on the linkages between agriculture commercialization and nutrition is sparse, mixed, and inconclusive. In some studies, you find that agriculture commercialization is claimed to make smallholder farmers worse off in terms of food security and nutritional outcomes, but the burden of these effects of commercialization are most felt by some vulnerable groups within the households, but also within the communities. And specific examples of these are women and children. So the available evidence is insufficient, but for all the studies that are available, they are also calling for more robust analysis that is based on sound research designs to be able to unpack any underlying associations. There are also some other studies among the framework of literature on agriculture commercialization and nutrition that emphasize the fact that welfare and nutritional benefits of agriculture commercialization can only be revealed through the gendered lens. In other words, if you get women to work together with the men and they have the ownership and possibly also the decision-making of these cash enterprises, then you likely will get benefits out of these enterprises. Next slide, please. And we also know from some other literature that increased women's autonomy and empowerment is beneficial to household welfare, but it also has substantial contributions to the reduction of undernutrition, both for women and children. The reason in specific reference to children is the fact that empowered women would put dietary quality and improved feeding practices for children into consideration, but they are also being perceived, women are also perceived to be vital in safeguarding children's interests. Yet we know from so many other studies, but also from the physical presence and observation in communities in rural-based households, that the decision-making and ownership of resources, including cash crops, in most of these societies is constrained. And so specifically for cash crops, men are usually the main asset owners, but also the decision makers of how the cash or the revenues generated can be allocated to different members of the household. Next slide. So our objective in this study is try to bring all the 3 aspects together and rigorously attest the assumption that when women are given the opportunity to own and all make decisions in relation to cash crops, they will put children's interest at the front and use the cash income raised to improve the children's nutrition status. We find these gaps really interesting, but we also, I think, contribute to the literature that is quite limited using a large panel data set that covers most of Uganda for a long period of time. So we take advantage of that data. The second one is that we try to improve the analytical methods by accounting for quite a lot of heterogeneity, both observed and unobserved at the household level, at individual child level, but also at the contextual level. Another contribution in this sort of like framework of analysis is that we want to test the robustness of our results to see how stable they are and examine if the effects of commercialization are actually cutting across different children categories based on gender and age. Next slide. Next slide, please. So the data that we are using, as I said, comes from 6 districts of northern Uganda. Can you please go back? Yeah. So it comes from 6 districts of Uganda, and the study that were supported by Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Nutrition. As you can see, the purple dots on the map are showing essentially where the households are located. And we had about 3,200 households at the baseline in 2016. We followed up these same households in 2014 and the end line in 2016. And for the whole sample, we have about 12,000 children that are aged 0 to 5 years. We collected quite a range of data ranging from agriculture, nutrition and health and endowments, but also of course on gender roles and the sex of household heads and all that. And then we also collected child anthropometry data. Next slide. So we are focusing here on a subsample of households that are growing cash crops. And that sample definitely then now becomes down because we are focusing on households that have a child that is aged 6 to 59 months and whose anthropometry, the anthropometry of these children were taken. And then for those households that were growing traditional cash crops, and traditional cash crops in Uganda here mean coffee, cotton, sunflower, sugarcane, and sesame in the 6 months prior to each survey round. So the sample becomes small because we are focusing on mainly those traditional cash crops. And this diverts a bit from the previous presentation because here we really focus on mainly those crops that cannot be consumed at the household level. Next slide. So as part of the results, the dependent variable for us would be the child nutritional status, which is HAZ scores. And from the graph that is presented on the right-hand side of your slide, of your screen, is showing HAZ scores on the y-axis and child age. What is observed here is that in the trend of child growth essentially is not any different from what we know from literature. We see that child HAZ scores rapidly decline at birth, from birth until the age of about 20 months, which confirms the fact that child faltering happens in the first 1,000 days of life. So our results are not any different from what has been presented before in literature. But what is also observed is that children from cash cropping households are slightly taller. So in other words, they should be fairly healthier than from non-cash cropping households. Next slide, please. So our primary exposure variable is women empowerment, and we measure women empowerment based on, we know from literature that women empowerment is multidimensional and context specific. Even within the same sort of like country, you could find different empowerment indices if you're using the same index, but we get into the main sort of like framework of having measuring women's empowerment based on the women's ability to make strategic decisions in life, and also able, with respect to cash crops, the ability to negotiate increased decision making in their households and the ability to fully utilize their available resources, especially when this ability has been limited within the same household, but also in relative to the community. So the evidence between these various indicators of women empowerment is, and child nutrition outcomes is often inconclusive, and some studies that we have show insignificant relationships. And we think that this is due to the limitations in study designs and analytical methods using, only descriptive analytical methods, but also failure to address endogeneity concerns that potentially undermine the reliability of the actual relationships in play. Next slide. So in our data collection, we included questions that measure women empowerment as who actually owns the cash crop and who makes decisions on the cash crop and who actually controls the crop itself, who makes the decisions on whether or who to buy and purchase inputs and sell the output. So these three were the key questions that we asked for a lot of assets, but also enterprises, and one of these enterprises was cash cropping enterprises. In the analysis, we find that 2 and 3, so the actual control and the making of decisions on the use of revenues is essentially the same, and so we combine these to form the decision making, and this definitely brings in the context specificity that we are talking about. So households were meant to select either the main man as the main decision maker or owner of a cash crop. They would also choose possibly also the main woman, and in some cases then you'd find households that are jointly making decisions or you're claiming to jointly own the resource. Next slide. So in our analytical approach, we give a lot of concentration on trying to account for selectivity bias or confounding, because if we do not account for it, then it would be difficult to draw unbiased conclusions on the relationship between women empowerment regimes in terms of ownership and decision-making for cash crops and the key nutrition outcomes, in this case, HAZ scores. So we know, selection bias could stem from the fact that there are unobserved factors, those factors that could influence women empowerment and child nutrition simultaneously, but we cannot possibly also be able to observe them while in the field. The second source of these confounders would be a potential reverse causality, where you could assume that the households that have women who have well-nourished children may earn more respect from their husbands and communities, rendering such women more independent in cash crop and decision making. So when we do not account for these selectivity biases, then we likely will get not very good results or good estimates. Next slide. So to account for that, we use a combination of regression methods, the first one being the multinomial endogenous treatment regression, in which the first stage we predict the factors that determine women empowerment regimes. So does a household belong to a sole man ownership or decision making? Does it belong to a sole woman or joint ownership? And if that is the case, what factors really determine that? And then we generate a selectivity collection that we put into the second stage of the estimation. And that second stage is essentially estimating the effect of women empowerment on the child HAZ scores. We combine this meta model with correlated random effects model to control for unobserved time invariant household heterogeneity that will likely be correlated with observed covariates or those observed factors that we can see. And then we do this essentially by including the mean of the time varying household level explanatory variables. Next slide. So to be able to identify these meta models, it's recommended to use instrumental variables, and our instrumental variables are based within what is termed as the cognitive neighborhoods. So those factors that essentially make women either more empowered or less empowered, and that includes the first one as the household's marital status. The second one, we look at the proportion of other households in the community, specifically the parish, where households solely or jointly owned cash crops. So, and then the third one is the proportion of other households in the parish where women solely owned or jointly made decisions on the sale and the use of revenues. So the three instrumental variables are the ones which are used to identify our models. Next slide. So here we go to the results. The first result is that we find that after accounting for all the observed and unobserved heterogeneity, we see that if we have a household that is led by a sole woman, then rather cash crops that are owned by sole women in households, then these households tend to increase HAZ scores by 0.59%. I don't show these results here, but that translates into 14% reduction in stunting, which we think is quite huge. The second result that I have is that we have a negative selectivity bias, and indeed we have confoundedness that would affect consistency of these estimates if it had not been considered. So what we see here is that there are unobserved characteristics of households or individuals that limit the women from owning cash crops, which ultimately then has an effect on the child HAZ scores or stunting. Next slide. Our result 3 is also showing that when sole woman decision-making is at the household level, then for these cash crops, then child HAZ scores are increased by 0.64% points rather, and that is translated into the 20% reduction in stunting. So the decision-making itself is much more important than ownership. So if ownership cannot be done, but then the woman is in charge or can be able to make a decision, then this gives an edge over the ownership in terms of reducing stunting. Here we also see, which we didn't see in the ownership module, that joint decision-making for a woman versus a sole man. So in reference, the sole man increases child HAZ scores by 0.31%, which translates to about 17% reduction in stunting. Again, we see that the variable for confoundedness here is also significant, but again negative, which also confirms the selectivity bias that I talked about in the previous slide. Next slide, please. So the question would be here now, how are these effects felt across the different child subsamples? We see what the result for that we have here is that women empowerment, both in terms of ownership for panel A, but also decision-making for panel B, is that women empowerment is beneficial for all child groups. But another analysis, and the results are not shown here, is that the stunting effects were much more precisely estimated for sole woman ownership in older children above 2 years and for male children. And these results are not any different from what has been presented, not necessarily in empirical studies, but what has always been presented in other parts, specifically in West Africa, where male children are favored by their mothers. And I think for the older children, it's much more to do with the biologics. Next slide. So I want to come to a conclusion here, and yeah, women in Uganda and other countries in similar contexts own less or no assets and play constrained roles in decision-making of income-generating activities, including, of course, cash crops. The available literature shows that women's autonomy and empowerment can be beneficial to household welfare with implications for improved childhood nutrition outcomes. But we also have other literature that shows mixed relationships between agriculture commercialization and child nutrition. It is argued and advocated for that nutrition benefits may be leveraged through the gendered lens. However, we don't have a lot of evidence to support this, but also to support policy decisions. So in our study, we tried to contribute to this limited literature, and we empirically tried to analyze the relationships between women empowerment in cash crops in Uganda and child growth outcomes. We used a relatively lean but relevant indicator for women empowerment that is essentially looking at who owns and who makes decisions. Is it by the man alone? Is it by the woman alone? Is it both? And how does that affect nutrition outcomes for children? Next slide. So we employed the multinomial, mixed multinomial methods with instrumentation, and we take advantage of our panel data set to address any form of confounding issues that we are often associated with women empowerment. And we find large and consistent associations between women empowerment regimes and child HAZ scores. In particular, we find that women empowerment in cash crops reduces stunting by at least 14%, which is rarely achieved by many standalone interventions in developing countries. So our results are much more convincing than previously appreciated, and because these potential confounders are well accounted for. when we look at the heterogeneity of the households and the children based on age and sex, we find that women empowerment actually benefits all children categories. Next slide. So our study shows that intra-household dynamics and bargaining power in relation to agriculture-mediated cash plays an important role in child nutrition. The consequences of less empowered women in cash crop communities are, well, we see that they are clearly negative, because then if you don't have a positive, then you definitely have a negative. But they can only be well revealed when, you know, advanced analytical frameworks are employed, as we have done, or we have tried to do in this paper. So for policy implications, but also for programmatic advice, I think our results underscore the importance of ensuring that agriculture development efforts, particularly the promotion of agriculture access, agriculture market access and businesses, but not necessarily leaving out the issues to do with interventions in cash crops, should not be blind to women empowerment if we want to improve household welfare, reduce poverty, but also pay attention to child nutrition outcomes. There is still work to be done, but from what we have done here, or what we have so far done, we still have not gone an extra mile to understand what or how more empowered women do things that is different from those that do not have that sort of like empowerment, and what does the cash that is generated from, for instance, cash crops is used, and how is it used to achieve better nutrition outcomes. So I want to stop here, but I want to thank all the people that were involved in this research, particularly Patrick Webb and Shiban Ghosh, who are going to be involved, of course, in answering some of the questions, because they were working together on this paper. And I want to thank you all participants of this webinar, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for 3 terrific presentations. Lots of questions, some of which we have tried to answer online, but a number of them we have not yet. So let me start with, I'm trying to nest questions together. The first set of questions, Nazul, if you don't mind, I'll direct to you, because they revolve around this whole issue of commercialization of agriculture, which most people call cash cropping. I find it intriguing that these questions keep coming up, because as you know, Nazul, when you and I were working at different points in time in IFPRI, Patrick Webb was also there. There was a very polarized view on cash cropping good, cash cropping bad. And so the first question that's coming up, and I think it related to what you had in one of your slides, where you talked about either mixed results of cash cropping or insufficient data or insufficient results. And what is problematic is many countries in real time, meaning in 2020, are having to make decisions on their agricultural strategies. And a lot of countries, as part of a broader agricultural strategy, are emphasizing cash crop production. And so I would ask you, from the point of view of evidence you have, not just Uganda, but evidence you know of, what would you suggest to country policymakers as far as the emphasis on cash cropping as part of an agricultural strategy? What would you suggest, evidence-based, be the position of governments in emphasizing cash crop production?
Do you want me to go direct?
On that one, there'll be sub-questions, but let's tackle that one first. That's a biggie.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Eileen. And I think that's a very interesting question. Essentially, my advice is cash crops are good because they help countries earn foreign exchange. They also help households themselves run out of poverty. But I think I mentioned that in part of my, one of my slides, especially in the conclusions, is that if we promote cash crops as a mere cash crop, I know very many parts of Eastern Uganda where households produce a lot of sugarcane, for instance, but then they are suffering a lot from food insecurity. The mere fact is, when you get to those communities, is that the income that is generated or the revenues that are generated are owned by men, and men decide they do not really give a lot of attention to household sort of like welfare. They essentially go on buying bicycles, motorcycles, and possibly also cars. Then, of course, they relegate the issue of food security and nutrition to the women who are left with a very small piece of land to till. So my advice to government would be, yes, we need the cash crops, just like we need any other enterprises, but then we need to give the gender aspect and the women empowerment aspect very crucial, intervention, so to say.
That's an interesting, Nazul, that's an interesting example you bring up, because as you remember, on the sugarcane issue, I worked for about 10 years on sugarcane production in southwestern Kenya. And you're absolutely right that sugarcane tends to be a male-dominated cash crop. Decisions on that are dominated by males. Yet there we saw some positive effects, because even if it was a male crop, on average, incomes of the household who were sugarcane producers increased. Some of that income translated to improved caloric intake at household level. And some of that in turn resulted in increased caloric intake in preschoolers, and a lesser amount led to increases in child nutrition as measured by anthropometry. So a related question, again, getting back to this, what do we suggest to governments? You can't control issues like sole ownership of a crop. And so again, from a broad-based perspective, you started to say, I think your first answer was cash cropping is good on average. So how do you provide advice when the crops differ and control of the crops differ? Sometimes solely women control, sometimes not. Would your across, I don't want to pressure you too much on this, but would your across the board answer being, yes, cash cropping commercialization should be part of an overall agricultural strategy for countries, but taking into account some context specific issues?
I mean, Eileen, you're absolutely right. But what we see in several countries is that the agricultural policy itself is looking at production. It does not really look at like the benefits of this production. Who do they accrue to? If it is cash that is being generated from cash crops, for instance, but also even those food crops that have been turned into, cash crops, where does that income go? So you really need to look, you don't need to look at agriculture as a sole enterprise or a sole sort of like sector without looking at the other sectors. I would imagine that if you had the community development aspects included in giving, land ownership and also enterprise ownership, but also decision making to women, and that would call in several other ministries, for instance, Ministry of Gender and Social Development, for instance, then you'd have to make sort of like, I would not really want to push for the agricultural strategy as the agriculture ministry would want it, but I would want to see, that multisectoral sort of like engagement, what happens from the production, but also from the disposition point of view. So I think it's a mixed thing, and it might be a bit difficult to discuss and have a concrete answer for each and everything. But my understanding is, and that's what we're trying to do here, that we need not necessarily say that we push for cash crops and forget these other several sectors that would be important for the welfare of households and communities.
Thank you. Alexandra, there was a question that I think specifically you could answer from what you presented. And the question was, how much of the agricultural diversification that you talk about was related to or meant for commercial agriculture? And again, in your data, who made the decision on whether to produce these commercial crops, even though it was agricultural diversification, produce the crops, and who made the decisions to market? So let's start with agriculture diversification, how much of that was related to decision on cash cropping, to sell the crop?
So from the data that we have, it appears that most of the crops being grown by households in this region were what our colleagues in Tanzania would consider cash crop. And most of these seem to be sold in the market because these were maize and nuts and seeds. And so, yes, I would say that we don't know exactly because we don't have data on the crops being sold and how much of it was sold at the market. We just know what was grown, and it appears that most of this would be typically considered a cash crop. Does that answer the question?
Oh, thank you. Keith, I don't want you to think we're ignoring you, so let's get back to some of the data you presented, where you're talking about, or the question came up, and there's several of them, but let me start with the first one. Income in households, use for purchases of foods to improve diet. How much of that related to the distance to markets?
So we did not, thank you for that question. We did not measure income very well. It's a tough measure to get at one time a year. And so we concentrated on expenditures on food in the previous month as our indicator. So I don't know, is there a way to translate that into an expenditure question, related question?
Well, Keith, I'll just interject my own bias.
Yeah.
In the work I've done, I mean, total expenditures is usually a good proxy for income. So let me put it that way.
So what's the question again in relation to the purchases?
Yeah, the expenditures to improve diet, how much of that related to what I call market access or distance to market?
Yeah, so we assessed 37 markets each survey year that were proximal to the sampled sites, and so distance was in a way controlled for because it was the closest markets that we had. While we have GIS data, we have not evaluated the distance of the homes to those markets. But all the markets that we assessed in terms of in these surveys were local, and there are probably 40 to 50 foods that we evaluated prices for, and are relating those to expenditure patterns reported by the households. But I don't have that data.
Okay. Now a lot of questions, not just for Keith, but I'll start with Keith. Because these are such complex issues, but a number of questions, Keith, revolving around, were you able to look at what is being called social and cultural determinants to analyze effects on food security and nutrition? And let me give you an example. You don't have to respond directly on this, but when I traveled to the far western region of Nepal, I mean, one of the taboos related to when a woman had menses and they were banished from the household out to, what we would call shacks or whatever, which was not very positive. So were you able, in analyzing effects on food security and nutrition, to look at taboos like menstruation, things related to pregnancy, birth? How did that overcloud, or how did that affect some of your results you're reporting?
So a lot of that we didn't assess, but we do have data, for example, from the Terai, which is culturally very distinct from the hills and mountains, as we know, and the relationship between food production and availability and consumption is more complex in the Terai. The intra-household food consumption patterns are different, and the roles and perceptions of women and gender equity issues are different in the Terai. We know that, and so there are taboos. We also know that how food is consumed in the household depends on who is consuming the food with you. That's especially related to young children. And so those need to be untangled because they are going to affect they're going to mediate the relationship between what's grown and available in the household and what is consumed. I think, one of the messages, women we know, mothers are often the last to consume in meals. And one of the messages I think here is very simply that if the food is available, there is an increased tendency for women to eat more. What we haven't got is the gender gap, because historically we don't ask about what men eat, but that needs to be done more and more in order to identify that gap, which can be related to taboos. And so that is missing in these data and is a need for the future.
Thank you. Now, this next question will be for all three of the panelists. Florence has a great question about what does COVID tell us about cash crops and the effects on foreign exchange and any of the issues we're looking at related to food security and nutrition. I mean, that's such a new issue, COVID-19, but do we have any indication in any of the data sets in any of the three countries of the effect of COVID-19? Foreign exchange was brought up, but basically a larger issue on COVID-19 on food security and nutrition. Let's start with Alexandra.
Sure. So our data collection actually ended in August of 2019. So we don't have data on after COVID, but it is a big issue that I know that the food security world has been talking about for the last, I think, 6 months, of this reliance on cash crop, and when trade potentially diminishes between countries and countries rely on that for income or growth, what happens, and a focus on maybe a more localized food system and the benefits or the negatives also with a localized food system as well. But sorry, we don't have a lot of data.
No, I mean, this is a very recent phenomenon. Nasul, any more recent data on that?
Thanks. So we don't have data on COVID in relation to what we've been doing, but I can only mention that in the lieu of the fact that there's no tourism for a country like Uganda, I think the only source of actually foreign exchange, well, not the only one, but the major source of foreign exchange for Uganda has been coffee. Essentially, the coffee exports increased over the last, 5 months. And I remember the politics and all that has been talking about it as one of the key things that can save this country from running down. So, yeah.
And Keith?
Yeah, I can't talk to the foreign exchange issue, but this is a new phenomenon. It's not going to go away, obviously, for a couple of years at least. We do know that as food insecurity becomes worse, diversity goes down, the quality of diet goes down, whether it's Nepal or India or Bangladesh or anywhere. And as the stresses increase, we can expect these problems to become more palpable than before. We're going to probably lose some ground in the COVID pandemic. So I don't have an answer other than we're all aware of the problems of socialization and the problems of gathering in crowds and the problems that the poor have in complying with these basic procedures of social distancing and so forth. I think we all have our antennas up right now, and it behooves every field activity and study to be looking at how this pandemic unfolds, not only with respect to the cases of disease, but the stresses that are occurring in communities as a result of the disruption. We have a lot to learn, along the way right now, very quickly.
The only thing I'll add there is thank you for those answers. The World Food Program, with the data they're presenting, suggesting that what's happening to decrease livelihoods for a whole series of reasons is undoubtedly going to lead to increased food insecurity and increased hunger globally. But those are global data. Interesting set of questions, and this is going to be for all three of the panelists, related to empowerment of women, which is clearly critical when we look at control of income, food security, diets, nutrition. I'll just put this out, and I'll start with, we'll go in this order, Nuzul, Alexandra, and Keith. There is the perception that women are more empowered in African households than they are in this case, Nepali households. And so let me ask different measures of empowerment. I think, Nuzul, you use women's decision-making, but comment on the issue. We're asking for cross-country comparison. Do you think women, whether it's in Uganda or sub-Saharan Africa, do you think women are more empowered in Uganda or in sub-Saharan Africa than in Asia? And what is the basis of your saying that?
I don't agree with that. Thanks again, for the question. That's a very interesting one and intriguing. I don't agree with that, but I want to bring the fact that when you look at all the literature talking about women empowerment, to be honest, this is a context-specific issue. You cannot design programs. You can design programs that are cutting across, but in terms of whether in agriculture, whether in non-agriculture enterprises, the different forms of empowerment really matter and they are specific to a given context. For instance, in Karamoja, we all have known for a very long time, I'm using the example of Uganda here, that Karamoja is one of those places where, women empowerment seems to be low, and we, as researchers, we design methodologies, indices to go there and measure women empowerment. But actually, when you go to Karamoja, you'll be very surprised that women there simply make all the decisions for their household, and they don't own land, but they have a big say on livestock, which is like the major source of income and livelihood. So my thinking is that we need to take each of these, the women empowerment issues, to take them to a specific context and then design programs to address them there, maybe also as well as interventions.
Thank you. Alexandra?
Hi, I've done actually very little work in Southeast Asia or South Asia, and so I don't know if I can speak to the differences in women's empowerment between the two settings. But I do know from our work in Tanzania that women's empowerment does vary, as I think Nuzul was saying, between households considerably as well. And that we have seen that women who appear to have more empowerment in their household have higher dietary diversity. But I think it might be very hard to compare across countries women's empowerment and the effects that it might have on diet quality.
And Keith?
So I'm not the expert to be asking this question to, but one cannot help but notice where education of women has been improved, that the status, nutritional well-being of women increases as well. And I cite the huge education advances that have been made in Bangladesh, where I've been working for a number of decades, where the program to improve women's education has led just in the past few years. What we've noticed is more rural women have achieved a class 10 education than men in rural Bangladesh. And that's because of government programs to continue to educate women. On the other hand, early marriage disempowers women in rural South Asia. Getting married at 16 and 17, having a child at 17 and 18 turns what we've seen is a healthy, bounding young adolescent to a burdened young woman in her married life, and those social norms, are being addressed in South Asia, and that will lead to greater decision-making capabilities and these elements of empowerment that we all seek to address. So compared to Africa, my experiences in Africa are limited to Malawi and Zambia, and I don't think I could give you an authoritative answer on that contrast. But certainly it's a driving agenda in South Asia to undo these constraints on the ability of women to make decisions and to be more empowered.
Thanks, Keith. Now I'm going to have to do a rapid fire round because we'll run out of time. And by that, I mean questions specific to each presentation. And let me start with Nuzul. One question was your percent improvement on stunting seemed quite high. Are there other factors that you didn't present in the data that you think are accounting for this above and beyond the agricultural perspective?
Yes, very quick answer to that is that we are looking at the subsample of households that have cash crops, and these are not the typical households you'll find in Uganda. But essentially what we want to see is when we compare those households with cash crops and non-cash crops, then what, of course, women empowerment in these cash cropping households, then what happens to the stunting sort of like levels. And essentially we accounted for all household individual child characteristics and contextual characteristics, and these are the results that we get, and they seem to be stable when we employ different analytical frameworks.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Keith. Two specific questions. What was the plot size for agriculture in your households, and do you have any data on nutrition education?
So plot size. I know someone wrote in a question on that. I don't have that committed to memory right now what the plot size is. Under half a hectare is very, very common and amongst poor rural families. Under half a hectare to 1 hectare, and there's an obvious skew with wealth, but the plot sizes are not typically large, and they get divided with across with each generation. And what was the second one?
Nutrition education.
Yeah, we did not do nutrition education in the in this assessment, so I can't respond to that question other than it was a survey and there was no nutrition education offered.
Thanks, Keith. A very specific question, Alexandria. Do you have any data on wild foods?
So this also kind of relates to the question that someone asked about ultra-processed foods as well. And we used a food frequency questionnaire where we only looked at the specific foods we asked about. And while we had over 100 foods that are commonly consumed by women in this community, I do not think we included any wild foods or even any ultra-processed foods. And that is something that, unfortunately, you don't capture when you're using an FFQ because you're limited to the foods that you thought about a priori.
Yeah, good. All right, we have just enough time for about 30 seconds for each of the panelists to provide if they want any final comments, and I'll go in the order of presentation. Keith, 30 seconds on top line issues for you.
Top line issues relates to the multifactorial approach that many who are sitting around this virtual table right now are pursuing, whether it's through dietary counseling, nutrition education, education of women, examining what is possible to produce in the home, how to reduce food wastage that is going on in our broad community that can translate into increased amounts of food locally just by reducing waste. There are many different facets that can be pursued to increase the food availability year-round and from year to year. I think we have a long way to go. The data that we show and that others have shown in various reports from Nepal are that the diet continues to be low in diversity and low in nutritional content for women, not adequate, leading to micronutrient deficiencies with very, very real health consequences. And I would just encourage us all to keep plowing along in this direction.
Great. Alexandra?
I am, again, really thankful for this opportunity to share my research, and just very thankful for the opportunity to participate in this research. This study really sparked my interest in the linkages between agriculture and nutrition, but also the in-between as well, the entire food system and the food environment and how that might link to diet quality. And I'm really excited to continue working on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nazul?
Yeah, thank you, Eileen, and thanks everyone. Thanks most especially to our participants of this webinar. I'm really glad that we could share the results, and thanks for giving me this opportunity. I would want to emphasize the fact that this is basically on cash crops, but we're also working on livestock, so women empowerment in livestock. We have some results that we could perhaps talk about some other time, but essentially they are all focusing, looking at, pointing the same direction. So I'm sure that when we have the data that we have and the kind of data that we have, then we can be able to analyze several other things, and then we can give sort of like broad spectrum recommendations. So thanks once again for the opportunity, and I'm glad that we can have this kind of platform and discuss even within the midst of COVID. And I look for another opportunity to exchange through email, through whatever other form. Thanks again.
I'll just, my 1 second or one line parting comment as I thought of these presentations, terrific presentations and data. I have a paper coming out with colleagues from FAO, and part of it is the question, does gender talk bring us anywhere? You have to read the paper to get to the answer, but as much as we know, it uncovers more questions that we have, but we're making progress. And obviously the gender dimension of agriculture, diet quality, and nutrition is critical. And I would say, hold on, to be continued as we explore this issue further in forthcoming webinars as part of this series. Thank you for all the presenters. Thank you to all the participants, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.